Hello, guys. Good day. Welcome to another episode of the Young and Sane podcast. If you're new here, you're welcome. Absolutely welcome to our family. And if you're a returning listener, I appreciate you a lot. Welcome back once again. Welcome back once again. So, we've been on this series of talking about inner child wounds. And I've been having a blast right now. A blast in terms of getting to know a lot of things about this. Getting to know a lot of things about inner child wounds and especially how they show up in our adult years. And so, today we are going to be talking about the neglect wound. If you've not listened to the previous episode where we talked about, I think we talked about the abandonment wound, and then we talked about in the last episode we talked about the guilt wound. Today we'll be talking about the neglect wound. I hope you've learned a thing or two from all that we've talked about so far. So yes, and I hope you learn from this one also. So yes, let's get into what we have today, the neglect wound. A lot of people are victims of the neglect wound, but just because we're ignorant about it does not mean that it doesn't exist, right? It's there. So quite a few people know about it, are aware about it, right? That they've experienced a sense of neglect or emotional abandonment in their life, and it could all accumulate to being a neglect wound. Now, when we're talking about inner child wounds, we're actually talking about the wounds that we are gotten during our childhood days, right? And it can show up in the actual neglect or even emotional neglect, right? And it's cut deep. It's often a result of carelessness or abuse or indifference or unwillingness to help. So they feel neglected, feel abandoned, feel overlooked, and most at times, because we're talking about the inner childhood, right? And the likely culprits here would usually be parents, family members, relatives, could be friends, or yes, so it could be parents, family, friends, also partners inflicts this kind of wound. So the neglect wound is just like a hidden scar, and it has the potential to influence emotional well-being, and even more than we would care to admit. Of course, is a wound that's invisible, so people cannot really spot it out except they see it from your conduct or your state of being or just whatever. And it's just because it only manifests itself in observable behaviors that people can see, and people with neglect will act differently than their peers. Like you act in a way that is not really expected from people of your age. And just like any other wound, it can be overcome with patience, care, self-care, self-love. Yes, so it can be healed. So as I reiterated earlier, that when we're talking about neglect wound now, we're narrowing it down to childhood experiences that left us with the neglect wound. So this kind is usually picked up from childhood days, childhood circumstances, where you could have had very busy parents, single parents, or even unrealistic expectations of parents, of people. These all can contribute, and a lot of times the pain, the wound is unintentionally inflicted, but the effects now last longer than um what is expected. And so when children are left emotionally unattended or lacking in basic needs, they could develop the neglect wound. So when parents are caught up with their busy schedule, 9 to 5, and life, and it's not easy. It's truly not easy, especially when both parents are trying to work to meet up with life's demand, to take care of their children, to provide basic amenities and basic needs. It's very possible for them um, to be caught up in neglecting their children's emotional needs, and it's all because they are also struggling to get themselves together, get themselves back, and all of that. And some children could also experience this neglect because their parents choose to ignore their emotional needs, right? And I would say this again, most of the times it's not just because parents choose to neglect their children that this happens. A lot of times it happens unintentionally. They don't even know better, so they cannot even do better, right? And this could arise in children who this could arise in children, right, who lacked basic needs. So like they experienced a lack of adequate emotional care or attention from their loved ones, so they were deprived of basic or physical needs like clothes, quality nutrition, and all of that. And we've mentioned this, that it could have a very long lasting effect. um how it could show up in an adult's life is it could begin to have some common fears that are associated with this inner child wound. So such kind of person may begin to have the fear of not matching in society, right? They lose their sense of belonging, and then they have this reluctance to express their desires or their needs. And so they could go extra mile to become people pleasers and to avoid abandonment. And they will usually fear to be vulnerable with people, and they will stay away from situations that expose their true feelings, right? They don't want to be left bare, they don't want people to really know their emotional needs or state. Also, it could show up in them feeling like they don't matter, right? They lose their sense of belonging. I don't belong here. And then they would be afraid of voicing their opinions or asking for more than what they have been given. Then these people could also have the fear where they may avoid situations that make them feel vulnerable. We've said all of this, right? And so personally, I think neglect would have actually showed up in my adult life in the way that at one time I almost became a people pleaser, right? To try to do things and just avoid tension, do what people like, and all of that. At one point in time, also, it showed up, and it could be that a certain number of factors, not necessarily the neglect wound, right? And then there was another time again where I felt largely like I didn't matter. It was because it kept on reoccurring or showing up in almost everything I did, like probably underappreciated, not recognized, and so just like, okay, probably I'm obscure, probably I should stop getting involved in a lot of things, probably I don't matter, I'm not necessary, I'm not significant. So even voicing out my opinions or asking for help was something that I couldn't do, right? And then some of these neglect wounds, right, also show up in reluctance to form connections, to have friends, to get into relationships because they're afraid that they're going to be abandoned, they're going to be neglected, right? Those fears are just deep seated. And sometimes it could just be the fear of making commitments. It could also be the fear of making decisions for others. So you just usually feel like you're not in the best place to make decisions for others. Now, some of the signals of neglect wound could be feeling lonely when they're even in large groups, and then sometimes they'll fail to prioritize their own needs most often than usual. They feel empty inside and have low self-esteem about themselves, and hence they are aiming for perfectionism at all costs. I want it to be this certain way, to be so perfect, like this and that and that. And sometimes those people would have low expectations from others, so they expect someone to meet up to a certain standard, right? They just expect the bare minimum because they're suffering from neglect wound. Sometimes there are attempts to numb or ignore their own feelings. We've spoken about neglecting themselves. Sometimes they involve in poor decision making, understanding, poor decision making, attention disorders, and all of that. And then most of the times, I think this is the most common ones I've seen. People suffering from neglect ones that are attention seekers, deep attention seekers. So they engage in a lot of attention seeking behaviors, regardless of their age. Then there could be this, I don't know how to pronounce it, Munchausen syndrome, and is explained like when a person tries to attract attention on themselves by falsifying, causing, or exaggerating a factitious or real illness. So they may be sick, but they will exaggerate their sickness, and may be feeling pain and exaggerate it more than what it is because they desire to get attention to themselves, right? So there's just a lot of all these, right? A lot of all this. So there's a need for healing this inner child wound called neglect, and it's because this feeling of hurt that we carry into adulthood, a lot of times it doesn't only affect us and stop us from enjoying our lives to the fullest, it also prevents us from enjoying other people, right? And then forming lasting connections with other people, and also may even hurt other people, make them go through the same things that we are going through, the same wounds that we're experiencing. They would have those wounds in their soul. So it's very important for us to get healing from this hurt, from this inner child wounds, from all of it, right? And secondly, it's very important so that these wounds do not begin to manifest themselves in varieties of unhealthy ways, like self-sabotaging, addiction, unhealthy relationships, drugs, sex addiction, porn addiction, a lot of things, right? We just succumb to a lot of things because um we feel neglected, down, all of that. So, and then the circle continues and continues, keep reinforcing a kind of trauma loops that consist of a lot of triggers that lead to a pattern of behavior known as trauma response, both within ourselves and then also form these things in other people. So it's very, very important. It's very, very important that we seek healing. Now, there's a tendency to um, try to interchange neglect wound for abandonment wound, and of course, they have certain overlapses and interfunctions. But neglect, as we said from the very beginning, is specifically being uncared for, right? Having the feeling of being uncared for, ignored, overlooked. So, which can now lead to feeling unworthy of attention and affection. So, that is neglect and should be differentiated from abandonment wound, right? Now, emotional neglect, as minute or as insignificant as it looks, can actually be is a form of trauma and can have profound and long-lasting effects on a person's emotional and psychological well-being. Now, we're going to talk about how to heal from all these things. And then the first thing I want us to note is that you have to come to this place where you identify the very emotional wound, the very inner child wound that you're suffering from. It could be all of them, it could be most of them, it could be a few of them, right? And so that's like the first thing that's expected of us, right? To identify. Now, one of the ways is to look through different examples. Let's go through a list of examples of how childhood emotional neglect can show up, right? The list is not exhaustive, but this is like to give a guide on for us to identify some of those patterns or behaviors that could have made us to have the neglect wound. So first of all, when you are a child, ask yourself this question. Now we're trying to identify those things, right? That can point us in the direction of whether or not we have the neglect wound specifically for today. Now, were you given punishment for expressing your negative emotions, like when you were a child? Emotions like sadness, emotions like frustration, emotions like anger, outburst. Were you punished for those? Were you flogged, beaten, deprived food? All of those for expressing those emotions. That's one of the questions you ask yourself. Then, if your answer is yes, you know that was one of the ways you probably the neglect would be coming from. One of the examples that could be the roots of a neglect wound. Now, the second one is ask yourself, was there a lack of shared celebration or joy when experiencing a positive emotion like happiness or excitement. It might even be like replacing the positive emotion with a negative response, like when you're excited, I got first, and then I got first, I'm so excited, mommy and dad. Then they're telling you, are you the first person? Are you the first person? Sit down there. Is it your first? Are you the first person? So because you got first, now we should kick out for you. All of those things. So ask yourself, was there a lack of shared celebration or joy when you had moments of positive emotions like happiness or excitement? If yes, then you have a question to answer concerning neglect wound, right? The third question, an example. There are quite a few of them here, so let's run through quickly. Um, were you being told that your feelings or experiences weren't valid or worth further examination? Like when you're angry about something, when you're not satisfied about something, your mother or your father or your parents or your whoever could have told you, stop acting like a baby, or don't worry about it, or you're too sensitive. So that dismissal of your feelings and not addressing it could be a point of neglect. So another example is dismissed or ignored feelings, right? And this one, it's not even because your parents are telling you you are acting like a baby. No, it could be that they just decided to focus on themselves or another situation. So it's probably a child can be crying for food and all of that, and the parents are not even bothered about that. They just want to bathe you, take you to school. It could just be, right. So that kind of example, probably you're in need of something, and then that's not even their business. Like nobody's even responding to you. Everybody's just dismissing that you need and trying to focus on another thing or focus on themselves. Another example could be withholding or not showing affection when it is explicitly requested, or even though it is not explicitly requested. Now, a lot of us had parents that grew up in a place where saying I love you was very difficult for them. So when they gave birth to you, saying I love you was something that they couldn't conceive to do, because that was what a husband and wife were just supposed to tell each other, and that's once in a while. So my child, you're supposed to know that I love you because I gave birth to you, right? And there were sometimes, probably in our childhood days, that we were going through small stuff or that, and then you just need your parents to tell you I love you, I'm proud of you. Those little acts of reassurance and show affection were withheld or not shown. Another example is failure. Was there a failure to intervene or find a solution in situations where you were under an emotional distress? Now we may not even be able to define clearly the terms of what an emotional distress can be for a child, but let's say a child that doesn't know how to talk, and that child is uncomfortable and crying. Everyone is like, what is it, what is it, what is it? But the child is unable to talk, so the only show of emotion is crying, right? And then it's just ignored. So the failure to intervene or find solution to that child's situation could be a point of neglect for that child. So ask yourself that question. um so these are like some of the um examples, right? And we've gone through this, and I've said that we should ask ourselves questions concerning this. So first of all is to identify the root cause of whatever neglect wound we may have seen from the symptoms I've listed earlier, right? And now I mentioned that one of the ways to heal from it is to identify the root cause of that neglect wound, which led us to checking these examples of how neglect wound could be inflicted on people, right? And down that's the first one. Now the second one is to forgive your parents. Forgive yourself. Forgive, 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 forgive. Forgiving yourself is like one of the most important points of healing from a wound or a emotional trauma. Forgiving yourself and forgiving the people that may have caused the wound, the trauma, right? The people that may have been responsible for it. So we mentioned the first one, identify the root cause of that neglect wound, then go ahead and forgive. Forgive everything. Forgive everything. I'm not suggesting to you, I'm telling you that this is one of the ways to heal from neglect wound, right? Now, the third thing is to begin to love yourself and develop patience towards yourself. And I cannot state this point without saying that you cannot love yourself except you know the love of God. You cannot love yourself in a healthy way except you know the love of God, of Jesus Christ, of the Holy Spirit. Unless you know His love and unless you understand His patience, you cannot love yourself well. So I'm saying this now to emphasize the third point, which is love yourself and be patient with yourself. So you need to begin to develop a love for yourself and patience for yourself so that you can patiently, consistently and patiently keep on processing your life, right? Identifying those things that have caused you the neglect wound and try to consciously do away with them. And you cannot do it well if you don't love yourself and you are not patient with yourself. And one of the ways of loving yourself is going for therapy. You need therapy. Therapy is very, very important. Therapy is very, very important. When you love yourself, you will do things that will help you improve yourself, right? When you love yourself, you will do things that would help you become better. Yes, so we've mentioned all of that. That you need to love yourself and be patient with yourself. Love yourself and be patient with yourself, and I think that's the last point of it. After you've moved from identifying the root cause as the first thing you mentioned, right? You now go ahead to do what? To forgive the people that may have inflicted it on you, and forgive yourself. Forgive yourself, right? And then the third thing we mentioned is loving yourself and loving what? Loving yourself and then being patient with yourself, right? So when you do all of that, you love yourself, but you cannot know how to love yourself unless you know the love of God. And then you're patient with yourself, and you know how to be patient with yourself except you know how God is patient with us, right? And so you love yourself and you're patient with yourself, and because you love yourself and you're patient with yourself, you let yourself engage in activities that will help you improve emotionally, improve psychologically, improve in your thought patterns, in your conduct, in your behavior, improve in what you know about yourself, your self awareness, and your self identity, right? And you honestly cannot know all these things in a healthy way unless you know the love of God. Because I bet you the love of God can bring healing to a man's life, heart, soul, all of that. So, and then you will begin to see changes in in the way you right in the way you begin to act. So I just want to mention again some of the signs that shows that we are suffering from neglect wound as an inner child wound. So do you suffer from low self-esteem? Do you self-criticize, self-sabotage yourself? Do you suffer from low self-worth? Then about your emotional well-being, are you always depressed because you feel like you're lonely, everybody's leaving you? Are you always anxious that people will leave you? Are you always anxious that you will not matter to people? Do you always feel ashamed of yourself when you're in the midst of people and then prefer to just be by yourself? Do you have difficulty regulating your emotions? You can have extreme anger outbursts and in a second become ashamed of why you had that outburst. You are sensitive to criticism. You don't like people criticizing you. You feel usually empty or lonely. You have difficulty discerning, understanding, or even expressing your emotions. And then you are usually emotionally unavailable for others because you feel like you're not even getting enough emotions or attention or care or affection from people. You have poor social skills because of all of these things. You struggle to connect with other people. You have difficulty in trusting other people. You always isolate yourself. You have relationship challenges. That's very broad, right? But you are afraid to get into relationships because they may neglect you, they may not care for you, they may overlook you. Then you are afraid of abandonment or rejection. And then some of their behavioral patterns are they have impulsive behaviors, right? As I mentioned earlier, sudden outburst of anger and rage and bitterness and all of that. Usually they have a lot of aggression because they always feel neglected, and sometimes it could always also show up in the way they abuse substances, right? Substance abuse. So yes, if you have any of these or most of these, healing is not far from you. Healing is something that is available, right? And so, as I mentioned earlier, identify all of these things that you're going through. Identify the root cause of your emotional neglect wound, and then you forgive yourself and forgive the people that may have inflicted it on you. Then move on to love yourself fully and be patient with yourself fully to its full extent, and do that in God, and you get your healing from neglect. Because listen, God is a father, He never neglects his children. He never abandons his children. He never forsakes his children. He doesn't overlook us. He doesn't leave us uncared for. So if you begin to love yourself and be patient with yourself, because in the midst of finding out God's love for you and his patience towards you, you get your healing, guys. That's all I have for this episode of the Young and Sane podcast. I want to appreciate you all so much for staying glued and listening to this podcast episode. Thank you so much, you guys. Thank you so much. I would love you to share this. I would love you to drop a comment, right, and share this. And if you're not following this podcast, please follow it on whatever platform you get to listen to this on. Follow and remain blessed. Yes, remain blessed. So I'm still your host, Tamarflourish, on the Young and Sane podcast. And thank you for tuning into this episode of the Young and Sane podcast. I hope to see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for joining. Have a blissful week. Take care. Bye. Don't forget to stay curious, okay? See you on the next episode.